To get better, we need to train the right way. In badminton, coaches have different methods of coaching. Some work, some don't. But are there key principles that determine what works and what doesn't work? To dive deeper into this, we spoke to Professor Chris Cushion, who is an expert in sport coaching and pedagogy. He is currently the head of coaching at England Netball and has also worked with quite a few big Premier League football teams. In this podcast, we spoke about what is called as the traditional method of coaching and the issues it poses. We also discussed a few key things that are necessary to make coaching effective. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Badmintoo podcast.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
We are going to talk about different methods of coaching today.
We are.
And predominantly the work that you have done in football, netball, and your experiences from that.
Yeah.
And we have Chris on board for building a course with us on Badmintoo. And this is like a short intro to the course and why there is a necessity for a course like this.
Yeah.
So let's get straight into it. Firstly, I want to ask you about what are the current methods of coaching in sports right now? How do coaches coach overall?
It's a great first question. So typically, and I guess one of the reasons we need to think about doing things slightly different, we have what's come to be known as almost a traditional way of coaching. And what that usually means is we take a skill or an aspect of the sport, we break it down into smaller parts and we deliver it from the ground up. So we strip away a lot of the complexity, we detach it from the context, so it's disaggregated from competition or the context, and we create drills or practices that are typically unopposed. We might even break it down into smaller blocks and chunks, and we drill that, and then we start adding in partial pressure. And it's not until we get to the end of the session where the coaching session actually starts to mimic the game itself. So we've got this unopposed partial pressure game at the end kind of methodology to coaching is what we typically see, and that's been come to known as what people call traditional coaching.
So does the sport actually not look like the sport? Does the training not look like the sport?
Well, no, it doesn't look like that. The sport starts with, you play the game, don't you?
Yeah.
You play the game, you don't break it into smaller chunks or pieces
Yeah.
or bits and pieces. So the training itself doesn't typically mimic the context or the experience of the athletes or players, essentially. They might get to a game at the end, but very often we reduce things, we disaggregate it, we do other bits, in this ascension of building blocks, building towards the game rather than actually having training that's representative or resembles the game.
Okay, and what are the issues with this? Because from a very simplistic point of view, it seems like any sport is going to have a lot of complex bits.
Yeah.
And in order for someone to learn all those complex bits, it seems like a logical first step to break it down into small steps.
It's very intuitive, isn't it?
Yes.
To think like that. What we have to think about is the difference between performance and learning.
Okay.
So a learning environment's very different to something where we're teaching someone just to do something.
Yeah.
Learning, of course, is about retention and transfer. So when we're in our sessions, ideally we want people to be able to retain what we're teaching them, the thing that they've learned, and transfer it into a different setting, normally competition or a game down the line.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that the way that we think about traditional coaching counterintuitively doesn't help create a learning environment. So as soon as we start breaking things into smaller pieces, we might call that blocks, or into smaller chunks, as soon as we start stripping away complexity and context, we're actually creating an environment where people can perform the skill and look like they can do this, but we're actually creating an environment that doesn't support learning and transfer. And it's very counterintuitive. Because as you say, it makes a lot of sense to reduce it into smaller parts, disaggregate it, get really good at the parts, and then build it back together. But that's actually not great for learning.
Yeah. I think I was doing a training session and he was trying to get me to hit a backhand clear.
Yeah.
And he broke it down into small steps for me and said, okay, this is how you do. He threw a shuttle to me, I was performing
Yes.
a
good backhand clear that I would be, and I was quite happy with my progress.
Yeah.
But ever since that training, and even though I've trained and trained and trained doing the same thing, I haven't been able to hit a backhand clear in an actual match.
Right.
So is that something similar?
I mean, yeah. So obviously it takes time to learn something.
Yeah.
So you need to practice it. So I don't know how long you've been practicing it for. So it could take a bit of time. So we just have to be careful. So we're not saying that type of training or that type of practice is bad and we shouldn't do it. What we're saying, or what I'm saying, is that the order in which you do things. So there may be a place in our training where we can break this down into smaller parts, but certain things have had to have happened before that. So we know that that's what you need. So if I were working with you, I'd probably want to see you in a game.
Yeah.
I'd probably want to see you doing that task or attempting that task as close to the game as possible, whether it's we take some of the complexity out but we retain the whole task, and then make the decision about what type of practice activity we do. So it might be that that's what you needed, but the fact that you're still not able to do it in a game suggests that might not have been what you needed. You might need something else.
Okay. And is there a reason why this doesn't work, or is there a reason why this is the way that you described?
Well, there's a significant body of research that looks at the difference between performance and learning, and there's a significant body of research that looks at how you might structure practice and do practice design to create a learning environment. So yes, there are some learning principles that you can take on board that help basically create that learning environment and ensure that you have retention and transfer, i.e. you want to take that backhand clear into games, right?
Yeah.
And so we're training today, your game might be on Sunday or Monday, so we want you to retain what we've taught you and you be able to transfer it into competition under pressure at the weekend. So that retention and transfer thing, the learning piece, is really important, and how we organise and structure practice will influence the extent to which we're able to retain and transfer.
So in the current methods of coaching, people are still getting results. People or at least that is the current notion.
Yeah.
A lot of coaches, players believe that the way that they are training right now, coaching right now, is getting them closer and closer to the target that they aim for.
Yeah.
But is that the case? Is there something that we are missing here?
Yeah, it depends what you mean by getting results. I mean, ultimately, if you continually repeat, you eventually will get there, but that takes a period of time. But the issue that, there are a lot of common problems, and even with folks who seem to be getting results, you get issues around transfer. The example that you've cited, you practice something for a period of time, and whilst broadly you're getting results, there's still an issue around that particular shot.
Yeah.
So yes, you may be improving as a player more broadly, and on the surface it looks like you're improving, but ultimately there's still issues that aren't changing. So there might be specific aspects of somebody's game that isn't working. There's also this notion of performance under pressure.
Yeah.
So yes, again, things seem to be delivering success, but when the chips are down, when people are under real pressure, it all comes down like a house of cards. Now, if you've learned something, it should be pretty resilient to that pressure.
Yeah.
You should be able to do that. And of course, when we disaggregate skill or techniques from competition, from the game space, we lose a little bit of that game understanding thing. So even not under pressure, so it's reading the game, shot selection, those sorts of things. So again, on the surface, you could be developing someone who's technically proficient, it would seem, but doesn't seem to quite succeed, to outwit the opponent, for example, or to try to make really good decisions.
Yeah.
But because the technique and the skill haven't been really connected to that game understanding piece.
Okay. Sometimes when I train, so I'm basing this back to my experience in training, and when I train and I'm training a skill repeatedly, I seem to be getting good at performing that skill at that time on court. If I do it for 10 months, 12 months in a row, I'm constantly doing the same thing. I seem to be getting better at it.
Of course.
But I am not able to apply that to a match environment. So
well, again, we're back to that performance thing. So So that the way that you're training it gives powerful illusions of competence for coaches and for players. So
I like the word illusions.
So you feel that you're able to do it because you can produce the shot in training, you can hit perfect shots in drills, in practices, but it isn't transferring, right? So, you know, you're performing the skill, you haven't necessarily learned the skill, and that's the difference. And the thing about when we train for performance, it creates this really powerful illusion of competence for players and coaches. So if I was your coach, I could see you doing it, saying, oh yeah, you're getting really good at this, and then be scratching my head when it doesn't work in a game. So I don't understand, because you could do it, so what's the problem with you? So must be something wrong with you, Yash, because you can't do it, rather than thinking about, oh, actually this might be rooted in the way that I'm practicing.
So if that is the case, then is there a better method to it? What is it called, and has it been used?
There's a more... Well, it's basically applying the evidence-informed principles that we know about learning and how we structure practice. So if we think about practice design and the order in which we practice and the type of activities that we do and in what order, we are more likely to create a learning environment. So it's applying these principles. So I think it's being more thoughtful and understanding why we're doing the practices we are, with the aim of developing the skill or whatever it is we're trying to develop. So I don't think it's particularly a method. I mean, you talk about, you can connect it to more a game base or a game centered approach, because you're trying to draw as close to the whole context as you are. But for me, it's really about applying those evidence informed principles about practice design, really, the order that you do things and why you do them in that order to create the type of learning environment that you want.
Okay. And is this type of evidence-based principles that you're talking about, can they be applied to all training drills let's suppose in different sports, in the sport of badminton?
Yes. So, I do work outside, in sport and outside of sport, and I apply the same principles. If someone's trying to learn something, and if there's a motor skill aspect to it, those training principles apply. So the order that you practice, what you practice, and the order in which you do it will impact whether you're able to create an environment that makes you look like you're doing it now but doesn't transfer, i.e. you haven't learned, or whether you create a learning environment.
Okay. And could you tell us a little bit about your experience of using these principles in other sports? Like you've worked in football.
Yeah, I've worked in football.
You work in netball right now.
Yeah, sure. So the netball space is very traditional. So it's very unopposed practice, partial, breaking things down into smaller chunks, lots of unopposed repetition, adding pressure with a game at the end, and in netball it suffers from the same issues. So decision making under pressure, poor transfer, lack of game understanding, really. So as head of coaching at England Netball, I'm trying to implement a more game centered approach. So we start with, we just order practice differently and base it around the game. So we try and make practice resemble or look as much like the game as possible. And that's how I would advocate coaching in football. So again, I would use call it a games-based approach, but think about the order in which you do things and why you're doing it. So you wouldn't necessarily start with an unopposed, broken down technical drill. It would be really unusual for a training session that I was doing to start like that. It would be a whole task or modified version of a whole task, as connected to the game-like thing I'm trying to develop as possible, and then work out what the learner needs and then structure practice accordingly.
Do you recollect any incident which you recall very clearly in your experience in, let's say, football or netball, where you have seen these methods being implemented and a different result or a better result?
I'm not sure it's I'm not sure it's about a better result or a different result. It's about different outcomes. What you're trying to do is almost, one of the roots or one of the kind of founding thoughts around this kind of unopposed to opposed practice is we focus on skill first.
Yeah.
And then decision making and game understanding afterwards. Whereas I would flip that round and say, we want to develop game understanding and decision making and develop skill at the same time. Because in a game situation, the thing, you have to make decisions and execute skills, right? So skills then become the thing that you use to solve problems. So the sessions are about different types of outcomes. So it's really about good decision making, good game understanding, and then understanding when and where to apply skills. So we wouldn't take your backhand clear and just drill it.
Yeah.
We'd understand when and where you'd need to do it and put you in that situation, and then work on, okay, it's coming, so you connect to shot selection and that sort of thing. So for me, it's not necessarily about being better, it's about thinking about different outcomes and recognizing that decision making and skill need to be grown together. You can't put one before the other.
Okay. And it's quite interesting the way that you think, because I have been coached for a long time, and I've seen coaching not just in badminton but in cricket. I come from India, so people are crazy about cricket. It always looks like the traditional form that you have talked about. What I'm curious about is how easy or difficult is it to restructure or move from this traditional method of coaching to this newer method?
It's a challenge, because if it was easy, we'd have been able to do it, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't be having this conversation. So it's definitely a challenge. So I think there's some levels to it. So there's a conceptual level, how people understand how people learn. So I think there's this notion that you learn by breaking things into smaller bits and drilling it over and over again, and we need to maybe challenge that and think about the learning versus performance piece. There's a pedagogical or a coaching practice piece. What does that then mean for practice design? So being comfortable with not doing the traditional thing and starting practices in different way, or thinking about the order of practice in different way. And I think there's also a cultural thing. There's a real traditional way in sports of what coaching should look like and what coaches should do. And that's really, really powerful, particularly if you're in a job or you're employed or you're working with young players and their parents. There's an expectation that coaching looks a particular way.
Yeah, you don't want to do something which
it can be really
looks odd.
It could be really, really challenging to change that. So I think there's lots of levels to this, which makes it not straightforward to do it, to change, even though that we know that there's better evidence-informed ways of structuring coaching. It's definitely a challenge, but I guess the first step is being willing to try and have a go at these things and see how it works, and also being a little bit more player or athlete centered. So that traditional approach is very coach led. So the coach decide what somebody what they want to work on. They construct the practices. It's all very much about what the coach says and does, rather than really observing the learner or the athlete and saying, well, this is happening. How do I get to this place? Let's work on maybe structuring it slightly differently. So there's a whole athlete-led, coach-led piece as well here. And again, traditionally, the coaching environment is very, very coach-led.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned about one challenge here that that is currently there, which is why we haven't moved to this different way of coaching, which is how people perceive that coaching looks. What are some other challenges here, according to you, that are preventing the adaptation of these methods, or why these methods haven't come into force so far?
Well, there's a whole belief-based versus evidence-based approach. So there's some strong beliefs out there. If people have a perception that what they do works, why would they want to change? But we really need to interrogate that what works thing and ask challenging questions. So, there's a strong cultural or subcultural piece. There's pressure from the organisation. There's a reliance on beliefs-based coaching rather than evidence-informed coaching. So there's a whole range of pressures on folks, to coach a particular way, I think.
Yeah, I quite like the word you used, evidence-informed, because a lot of the times when practitioners go to meet a coach, coaches ask you a whole range of questions. Now, research is an intensive process. You can't have answers to all questions.
Correct.
So you can't say that everything that you say is evidence-based.
No.
But I quite like the word you used, evidence-informed, because then you can say that everything that you are saying or basing your
I think
theory on.
and it's not my quote, but I think there's a really good quote that says that everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. So you have to, so you can't. It's evidence informed and they're principles. So you work with the principles, but they need to adapt to the context and the athletes or the players, right? So if we, your example of Indian cricket's really interesting, and talking as well to recently to the Pakistan Cricket Board about the amount of children who just play street cricket and different street versions of the game, who already got this, almost perceived natural hand-eye coordination because they've just played on the street, essentially on strips of dirt and all the rest of it, and then they come onto amazing surfaces and so how you'd go about working with them might be very different to somebody who's never played. Yeah. Who's had a very, maybe a more westernized upbringing, not played it in the school, don't really play it with their friends, but are learning the game. You'd still use the principles, but how you'd go about doing that with the learners would be very different and culturally different as well. So there's, so we can't just uniformly pick things up and drop them in. We take the principles and we adapt them according to the environment that we're in and the learners that we're working with.
Yes. What I'm thinking about right now is all of this seems very interesting, but systems and the way that you are doing right now, these methods, the way that coaches are coaching right now, it would take time to change. So if someone, let's suppose, learns about these things, is it possible for them to start implementing it directly?
Yes.
Or is there a...
Well, we are the system, aren't we?
Yes.
So, again, with the coach development and coach education and training that I do in other spaces, within the first... So I'm not a very PowerPoint orientated person, and I'm not a very chalk and talk type person. Within the first 10 minutes of a course, people are having a go at doing something. Yeah. So once you've got the principles, once you've got a sense of what you can do as an individual coach, you can do it in your next session, or you can take a section of that session and say, I'm just going to try this and see how it works. So I think individuals are incredibly empowered to just do stuff, just to try things out. So for me, it's almost paradoxical. It's incredibly difficult on one hand, but on the other hand, it's actually quite easy. If you have that willingness to have a go and try these things out, then you literally can do it in the next session that you're coaching.
And for someone to learn about all these things, is there an educational background that they need, or is it just the willingness to learn, or do they have to come from a particular background, know some things before they...
Not really. I mean, you pitch your coach development and your coach education to, again, the same as you would with a player. There are things that you need. I mean, for me, the principles remain the same regardless of the context. So I would use the same principles working with players who'd never played or are very young, and the same with elite performers. So I would coach using the same principles. But what changes is the complexity of the task, the demands that you put on the learners, the speed of everything. All of those things change. But what doesn't change is the evidence-informed principles about what creates a good learning environment. So I think if we flip that around, the same with coaches, you pitch it's just about the principles remain the same. The complexity of which you learn them and start practicing with them will change depending on your level of experience, I would say.
Okay, I completely understand. To finish off, I have one simple question for you. If you were to name 3 key advantages of using this approach, what would they be?
So I think creating learning environments, better decision making, better decision making under pressure, and I'll give you a fourth one, is it helps you maximize practice time. So you're thinking, so this approach, things are layered rather than, in a very traditional thing, it's very end on end. You do this, then you do this, then you do this. But in this approach, if you think about your practice in a different way, you can start layering different things on top of each other. So you start being more efficient with your practice time. So that's 4 things.
So the layer that you talk about, it is doing multiple things at the same time?
Yeah, because you're retaining you're retaining some of the connections of the complexity to the game itself. That's already embedded in. So if you don't actually play the game, if you've got a 90-minute session and you coach for an hour and 10 minutes, you've got 20 minutes for a game. But if everything's grounded in the game, or is game-like, you don't have to worry about the 20-minute game because you've been doing it for the whole session.
Yeah.
And because you're doing more than just isolating this little thing and doing that and then adding another thing and then adding another thing. Because there's lots of layers to it, you can maximize practice time.
Okay. Well, it has been absolutely fascinating having this conversation with you. I am very excited to have you on board and to have you building these courses with us.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for the courses that we are doing with Professor Chris Cushion. We have put them out on the website that they are coming up, but you would be able to see the actual courses in due course. So thank you so much for your time, Chris.
It's a pleasure.
It was an absolute pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
And look forward to working with you.